at the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education in Gainesville, Florida, the University of Florida. He published a book just last year, I think December 23, about Milton and Orientalism. And now today, so he will speak about, present a paper whose title you see in front of you, The Dragoman and the Scholar, Ali Ufki, Isaac Barrow, and the Orientalizing Poetics of the Religione Turcica of 1658. Please, Thomas, thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My Milton monograph, I should say, isn't about Orientalism, but don't worry, I'll have a very small advertisement at the end of the talk. So Milton, Longinus, and the Sublime in the 17th century. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Vladimír and Stefano for the invitation. It's an additional pleasure to be doing so under the auspices of Scientiae, but also the Institute of Philosophy with its Department of Comenius Studies and Intellectual History, as the name of Comenius will be popping up a couple of times, and not by design, but just as a sign of his influence in this period. So I should note before beginning that this research comes from the introduction to a book-length translation project that I'm working on. I'm completing this for the Bloomsbury Neo-Latin series. And so therefore, it doesn't have an argument as such, but I nevertheless hope that you will find the material interesting as a case study of the history of Orientalism. So the book in question will be offering the first ever translation of a Latin poem about Islam that was composed by the Cambridge scholar Isaac Barrow during a visit to Istanbul in 1658, which is entitled De Religione Turcica, or On the Turkish Religion. Turkish, of course, then functioning as something of a synonym for Islamic, due to the prominence of the powerful Ottoman Empire at the edge of Christian Europe. So, to begin with, the polymathic Barrow enjoyed a remarkable academic career. After holding a fellowship at Trinity College, Cambridge for around a decade, much of which time he spent abroad, Barrow assumed the Regius Professorship of Greek in 1660, before becoming the inaugural Lucasian Professor of Mathematics in 1663, in which capacity he famously taught a young Isaac Newton, who ultimately succeeded him in the Lucasian chair. He was elected Fellow of the newly founded Royal Society in 1662, appointed Professor of Geometry at Gresham College in London from 62 to 64, Royal Chaplain to Charles II in 1670, and finally Master of Trinity College in 1672, also serving as Vice Chancellor of the University of Cambridge in the academic year 1675 to 1676. In 1675, John Evelyn praised Barrow as that excellent, pious, and most learned man, divine, mathematician, poet, traveler, and most humble person. But while Barrow has to some extent retained his reputation as an influential mathematician and an eloquent preacher, his roles as a poet and a traveler have since faded into obscurity. For his excursion to the Eastern Mediterranean in the late 1650s, his amateur interest in Oriental studies, and his skillful corpus of Latin verse have until now attracted exceedingly little attention. And so in this talk, I hope to bring some light to Barrow's Ottoman travels, his encounter with the fascinating figure of Ali Ufki, and the composition of De Religione Turcica. So by the mid-1650s, Barrow, who was a royalist in politics and an Arminian in theology, saw little hope of academic preferment under the Cromwellian regime in England, and he therefore found it opportune to leave England in a kind of self-imposed exile. After obtaining a travel stipend available to fellows of Trinity College, perhaps with the support of his former tutor and mentor, James Duport, who had been elected Trinity's vice master that year, Barrow received a passport on the 4th of May, 1655, and departed the following month. Slowly making his way through Paris to Florence on his way toward Rome, the customary endpoint of a continental tour, Barrow ended up lingering in Tuscany for some 8 months after the outbreak of the Naples plague in 1656 to 1658 halted his progress. By chance, when he learned that a ship in the port of Livorno was setting sail for Izmir in the Ottoman Empire, he seized the opportunity, embarking on the 6th of November, 1656. Now, it's worth giving this some context. Barrow's choice, though hardly unprecedented, was certainly adventurous. So John Milton, for example, this is the only time that Milton's name will come up, I think, in his 1638 to 39 continental tour, reached only as far as Naples, even if he later recalled his frustrated intention to continue south to Sicily and thence to Ottoman-ruled Greece. But some enterprising English travelers could and did make their way into the Eastern Mediterranean, and in fact beyond, and several had written accounts of doing so, among them Fynes Morrison and Henry Blunt. Crucially, over the preceding decades, the English Levant Company had established trading outposts in Istanbul, where the company's envoy resided, as well as in Izmir and Aleppo, which created small expatriate communities of English merchants in these cities who could host and support the occasional visitor. The Levant Company's Ottoman settlements were of sufficient importance that in the 1640s and 1650s, they became another site of contention between royalists and parliamentarians as part of the global dimension of Britain's internecine conflict. Yet a voyage to the Ottoman realms was still by no means routine, and if it promised more novelty than the standard stops of a continental tour, it also threatened more dangers. One imagines that the interest in Oriental studies Barrow developed at Cambridge, and I left out the details of this for purposes of time, but he did make an abortive attempt to learn Arabic under Abraham Wheelock. But one imagines that this interest in Oriental studies Barrow developed at Cambridge must have played some part in his decision to undertake this exciting but perilous journey. So I've just marked out very crudely here the path that he took. It did not take long for the risks to make themselves manifest. Leaving the Tuscan coast, Barrow's ship sailed through the Tyrrhenian Sea and approached Sicily without incident. Then suddenly, off the coast of Malta, 2 men of war, Turkish ships, attacked the vessel wherein he was, as John Aubrey later recorded, in which engagement he showed much valor in defending the vessel. Barrow narrated the episode in a long voyage poem, the Iter Maritimum, in elegiac couplets. And here he writes that he understood that what was at stake was nothing less than the utter loss of his liberty, dearer than living breath. The crew prevailed in escaping slavery or certain death, and Barrow's poem offers a portrait of the courageous captain who led them to safety, a large and generous man by the name of Mervyn, who was fond of wine and banter. So when the sails one time were drinking healths around the table, the captain is said to have declared that Barrow should toast his beloved Trinity College because you have a college in lieu of a mistress. They sailed by the island of Cytherea, which ignited Barrow's imagination of the famous cities and inhabitants of the Peloponnese that lay beyond, Sparta, Agamemnon's Mycenae, Nestor's Pylos, and landed at Melos, the southernmost island in the Cyclades, for repairs, where after 20 days at sea, we inhaled our native air with an eager mouth. Continuing through the Cyclades and past Chios, they arrived in Izmir on the eastern coast of the Aegean, where Barrow would remain for 7 months. It's worth noting that by the mid-17th century, Izmir had emerged as one of the most important ports in the Ottoman Empire. Venetian, Dutch, French, and English merchants had established outposts along the shoreline that attracted Armenians, Greeks, and Jews providing services, forming a cosmopolitan strip that came to be known as the Street of the Franks, or Europeans, or Gavur, infidel Izmir. It was also a city with a rich ancient history under the Greek name Smyrna, which traced its founding to the time of Alexander the Great and achieved some prominence in the early Christian period. Smyrna was one of the 7 churches of Asia featured in the Book of Revelation, as well as the episcopal seat of the bishop theologian Polycarp, one of the apostolic fathers, who was martyred in the urban stadium for refusing to do reverence to the Roman emperor. Barrow admired Izmir's ancient monuments, especially the amphitheater where Polycarp was said to have died, the ruins of which allowed him to envision the entertainments once performed there. It is possible, he writes, for you to observe the recesses and the cages and entrances of the beasts and the steps that the spectators sat on. Barrow was nevertheless unwilling to credit stories about the supposed tomb of Polycarp, which seems to have actually been the resting place of a Sufi dervish. Iter Maritimum further records the liberal hospitality that he enjoyed at the hands of his countrymen in Izmir, specifically the Levant Company's consul, Spencer Breton, a merchant diplomat who had earlier been the Muscovy Company's resident in Russia, and its chaplain, Robert Winchester, a fellow Trinity College graduate who had previously served the East India Company in the same role in Gujarat and Chennai, on whom Barrow bestowed high praise as another Polycarp of the Smyrnaean flock. Barrow would later compose a long Latin elegy on Breton after hearing of his death in 1659. So sailing north from Izmir in the summer of 1657, Barrow passed several locations in the Eastern Aegean, familiar from his reading of classical literature. And this is also recorded in the Iter Maritimum. Lesbos naturally called to mind its most famous inhabitant, the poet Sappho. Reaching the island of Tenedos outside the entrance of the Dardanelles, amidst the sea battle between the Ottomans and the Venetians, Barrow was prompted to create a rather dramatic Homeric comparison of his circumstances. Whatever blows detained the Danaan fleet of Agamemnon for 10 years detained us for the same number of days. Passage through the strait in antiquity, the Hellespont, further evoked the tragic love story of Hero and Leander. Finally, he described the imposing fortress of Istanbul called Yedikule, Turkish for 7 towers, which signaled the conclusion of his journey. Barrow completed this poem, his Iter Maritimum, describing the journey from Livorno to Istanbul within a few months of his arrival in the Ottoman capital. It bears the date of 6th of November, 1657, and evidently sent it to his colleagues back home soon thereafter. For on the 30th of March, 1658, Trinity College renewed his license to travel for 3 years. Upon disembarking, Barrow lodged in Pera, Beyoğlu, a district which developed from the medieval Genoese colony of Galata, Karaköy, which lies north of the historical city center of Istanbul across the waterway known as the Golden Horn. Dominated by the famous Galata Tower, built by the Genoese in the 14th century, Pera evolved into an enclave of foreigners as well as Ottoman Christians and Jews, much like the Street of the Franks in Izmir, and became the primary site for Western diplomatic missions from the Renaissance until the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. The 17th century Ottoman explorer and travel writer Evliya Çelebi suggests something of the character of the place in counting no fewer than 70 churches and 2 synagogues, and citing a land survey from the reign of Murat IV that estimated the population at 200,000 infidels compared to only 64,000 Muslims. Evliya further remarked on the various notorious forbidden ruby-dripping wines one could find in the district's many taverns, not a drop of which the pious Muslim imbibed himself, he insisted. As in Izmir, the small community of English merchants concentrated in the international district of Pera received Barrow warmly, particularly the Levant Company's ambassador, Sir Thomas Bendish. According to Aubrey, at Constantinople, he waited on the consul Sir Thomas Bendish, who made him stay with him and kept him there 1.5 years, whether he would or no. In Istanbul, Barrow took up what would become a lifelong and ultimately fatal opium habit. Was the cause of his death, claims Aubrey. More studiously, he devoted himself to reading the complete works of the Eastern Church Father John Chrysostom, the 4th century Archbishop of Constantinople, as might be expected given the appeal of the Greek Church to many 17th century Anglicans. Duport, Barrow's mentor, for instance, shared a similar interest in Chrysostom, to whom he devoted an ode in Alcaic stanzas, praising him as a Homer among the learned, the Alpha of the Fathers. But Barrow's intellectual interests in Istanbul were not limited to patristics. They extended to Ottoman culture and to the religion of Islam, as is indicated by a set of multilingual documents deriving from this period that were published among the contents of his posthumous opuscula. These include, following the order in which they are printed, an exposition of Islamic doctrine and practice in Latin entitled Epitome Fidei et Religionis Turcicae, The Superstition of the Turks, a brief text in English, an untitled list of Turkish words and their English equivalents, similarly 2 lists of Turkish officials with their Italian equivalents, a set of Turkish proverbs with Italian and in some cases Latin translations, and a true relation of the designs managed by the old queen, wife of Sultan Ahmed and mother of Sultan Murat and Sultan Ibrahim, etc., etc. This is relating to Qasim Sultan, written by me, Albert Babovius, then musician of the Seraglio and a spectator of these things. So most, if not all of these items likely found their way into Barrow's papers through the Albert Bobovius, to whom the last piece is explicitly ascribed, whose importance to De Religione Turcica, the long poem on Islam that I'm translating, is such that he deserves a proper introduction here. Albertus Bobovius is the Latin name of the Ottoman dragoman and musician Ali Ufki, a polyglot who acted as a major cultural intermediary in the 17th century. Born Wojciech Babowski in Lviv, in what is now Ukraine, but was then part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, he was captured in a Tatar raid and brought to Istanbul. It was there that he converted to Islam, took the name Ali Ufki, and served as a musician in Topkapi Palace for some 20 years before gaining his freedom. In the early 1650s, he was recommended to Bendish, the English ambassador, by Isaac Basir, the former chaplain to Charles I, then residing in Istanbul, and was thereafter employed by the English embassy, which explains how Barrow would have encountered him. Ufki worked on behalf of such major European Orientalists of the period as Jacobus Golius, Levinus Warner, Franciscus Meninsky, and Antoine Galland, the last of whom is, of course, renowned as the first European translator of the 1001 Nights, for whom he undertook translation commissions, composed expository writings about Ottoman and Islamic culture, and offered lessons in Turkish. Among the various works that Ufki produced on behalf of Western visitors to Istanbul were Turkish translations of the Czech educational reformer John Amos Comenius's Janua Linguarum Reserata, the Catechism of the Church of England, and most ambitiously, the entire Old and New Testaments. He also wrote a Turkish Latin grammar, a Latin tract on Islamic rites, and an influential description of Topkapi Palace in Italian that was then rendered into other Western vernaculars. Paul Reichert, who later served as the English consul in Izmir, used Ufki as a source for the present state of the Ottoman Empire in 1666. He is the understanding Polonian who had spent 19 years in the Ottoman court, mentioned in the epistle to the reader, later named as Albertus Bobovius, a Polonian by nation, but educated in the Seraglio and instructed in all the learning of the Turkish literature, from whom I freely confess to have received many of my observations. And Reichert's chapter on the assassination of Kusem Sultan, the Greek-born woman who at several points in the first half of the 17th century ruled the Ottoman Empire as regent on behalf of her sons and grandson, is virtually a transcription of Ufki's personal recollection of the event, the same relation printed in Barrow's Opuscula. Later in life, Ufki allegedly aspired to travel to England and revert to Christianity, as Thomas Hyde remarked in the preface to his posthumous publication of Ufki's tract on Islamic rites. It is highly to be deplored that he was prematurely snatched away by death before he could return to the Christian faith, which he intended to do wholeheartedly, longing to be able to earn his bread in some honest way in England among Christians and to be removed from the presence of the infidels. A set of papers concerning Ali Bey presented to the Oxford scholar Thomas Smith by 1668, when he left to serve as chaplain to the Levant Company's new ambassador in Istanbul, even suggests that Ufki may have practiced his faith secretly as a kind of crypto-Christian. He then privately compressed himself a Christian in Woto, and 'tis said still perseveres the same. So the various documents that are printed in Barrow's Opuscula, apparently gathered from among his papers, attest to the young Cambridge scholar's curiosity with regard to Ottoman religion, politics, and history, as well as the Turkish language, such that one can think of him as a kind of amateur Orientalist. The word lists and proverbs suggest that Barrow wanted to learn at least the basic vocabulary of Ottoman life. The superstition text brings together short miscellaneous notes that evince an interest in Ottoman cultural phenomena, and Ufki's relation regarding Kusem Sultan shows that Barrow was interested in recent history and political affairs. But the longest and by far the most interesting item among these documents is the Epitome Fide et Religionis Turcicae. The epitome, or as its full title can be translated, Epitome of the Turkish Faith and Religion spread by Muhammad the Qurayshite, prophet of the Arabs, first in the Arabian desert, later by his successors throughout almost the entire East, constitutes perhaps the most lucid, detailed, and accurate summary of Islamic belief that was available to Europeans in the mid-17th century. Its basic structure follows the 5 pillars of Islam, though not with equally proportionate attention. The entire first half of the text elaborates on the first pillar, the Shahada, or profession of faith, featuring a broad overview of religious doctrine from the revelation and veneration of the Quran to the 6 articles of faith, that is the oneness of God, angels, sacred books, prophets, the day of judgment, and predestination, and concludes with the rite of circumcision. The subsequent sections treat in turn the 4 other pillars of prayer, almsgiving, fasting, and pilgrimage, while a final paragraph expands on Islamic eschatology. Now, Barrow himself was until quite recently almost universally assumed to have written the Epitome, but I think that I've been able to demonstrate all but conclusively that the true author was Ali Ufki himself. And if you're interested in reading up on this a bit more, I have this article from 2022 in the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes. I should also note that that same year, a slim book on the Epitome came out by Clinton Bennett, featuring a translation by Daniel Perret. And I should just note it's a good translation. It's the only one that we have. But I must add a caveat lector that it is based on the erroneous presumption of Barrow's authorship, which means that Bennett's interpretation of the Epitome as, quote, pioneering Christian sympathy is unfortunately fundamentally mistaken. And I was pleased to see at least one book review that found my arguments as to the authorship of this convincing. But moving on, Barrow's relationship with Ufki in Istanbul is best elucidated indirectly through the correspondence of the young scholar's friend and patron, John Worthington of Jesus College, Cambridge. As early as February 1654, Worthington praised Barrow to the Prussian-born intelligencer Samuel Hartlib as a free philosopher who talks of traveling, and they seem to have remained in contact during his continental tour. After Barrow's return, Worthington recalled to Hartlib, I remember he told me that when he was at Constantinople, one Bobelius, he who wrote that Turkish story, being a Spahi and a servant in the Seraglio, and who gave him that collection of Turkish proverbs, both which I sent you, showed him his translation in writing of Comenius, his Yanua, into the Turkish language, so that the book has been attempted in more languages than Mr. Comenius perhaps knows of. Worthington later wrote to William Sancroft, then Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, discussing a Latin tract containing a better abridgment of the Mahometan religion than any I had seen in print, and some papers about the wonderful occurrences at the beginning of the reign of this present sultan, written by the same Bobovicus. Now, in both instances, Ufki's Latin name, Bobovius, is mangled, is Bobelius or Bobovicus, but I think it's clear that Worthington's testimony nevertheless confirms that Ufki not only composed the Epitome, and as a side note, there's a manuscript at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, that explicitly ascribes it to Boborio, another mangling. So this testimony of Worthington not only confirms that Ufki composed the Epitome and the relation of Kusem Sultan that were among Barrow's papers, but that Ufki personally gave him the Turkish proverbs and showed him his translation of Comenius. I think based on this, we can probably presume that the Turkish word lists were also supplied by Ufki as well. So additional details of this encounter are wanting, but the evidence is more than sufficient to indicate that Ufki did serve Barrow as a kind of cultural intermediary in his role as a dragoman, and perhaps also as a language tutor during his time in Istanbul, much as he did for other European visitors. Now, establishing this is important because it was the Epitome that provoked and informed Barrow's literary opus on Islam, De Religione Turcica. Barrow comments on the circumstances of its composition in a letter written to the Fellows of Trinity College from Istanbul on the 1st of August, 1658. Now, apparently, Barrow had not received word that his travel license had been renewed the previous March, for he apologizes for the long lapse in his correspondence and remains unsure whether his iter maritimum has actually reached its recipients. Pleading poverty and craving the renewal of his traveling fellowship, he encloses some nugae, trifles that he has composed fully for the sake of proving to you my observance of studies, which was a condition of his travel stipend. And he describes this in the following terms. I tried to put together in a poem a few things which I had collected concerning the history, manners, court, and religion of the Turks. A difficult effort, and I do not know whether it can be assailed by my powers, and whether I shall have been able to carry it to its conclusion, to make an attempt in any which way. Love of you all conquers. Lest I seem to say these things in vain and deceive you with an empty spectacle, this little fragment plucked from the middle of the petty piece, although unpolished in style, humble in invention, disordered in arrangement, truncated in its parts as being without beginning and without end, and lacking many things to be said in between, I have nevertheless dared to offer this to you, as it were the down payment on the rest. So we can see the Greek akephalon, literally headless, or meaning without beginning, that's used in this letter, matches the title of the poem as printed in the Opuscula, rendering it beyond a doubt that Barrow is speaking here of De Religione Turcica. Now, much of the verbiage in the letter is a rather empty performance of rhetorical modesty aiming at captatio benevolentiae, perhaps, but the passage nevertheless records several crucial facts about the poem. Most obviously, it is an unfinished fragment, one that belongs in the middle of a much larger work that Barrow had in mind. That larger work would have treated the history, manners, court, and religion of the Turks. And since this quote-unquote fragment of 997 hexameters, as it stands, touches only on the topic of religion, presumably this part, when finished, would have comprised one book of a perhaps four-book poem of some 4,000 lines or more. So we're talking about a highly ambitious undertaking, to be sure. But if that really was Barrow's plan, it never came to fruition, for there's no sign that he returned to the project or that he ever went back to revise the part he had drafted, such that the text of De Religione Turcica, as we have it, probably represents more or less what Barrow sent to his Trinity College colleagues on the 1st of August, 1658. Now, the first sentence of this passage is incredibly telling for how Barrow approached the composition of this poem. I tried to put together in a poem a few things which I had collected. So Barrow, that is to say, wanted to put into verse the information that he had obtained about Islam, principally through Ufki, so as to communicate it to his fellow Christian scholars. And while he undoubtedly wished to produce decent poetry, his fundamental aim seems to have been didactic, scholarly, and philosophical, the exchange of knowledge, the examination of ideas. And so in this respect, De Religione Turcica is not so distant from the tripos and act verses that Barrow wrote as Cambridge as part of academic exercises, which used the medium of Latin verse to engage with arguments in natural philosophy and theology. This approach aligns, moreover, of course, with the long tradition of Latin didactic poetry, whose ancient models include Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, Virgil's Georgics, and Manilius's Astronomica. A contemporary example of the genre is, for instance, the six-book botanical poem Plantae, authored by Abraham Cowley, another fellow of Trinity College until his ejection in 1643, with similar interests in the new science, and whom Barrow's tutor Duport praised as the most celebrated poet of his age. We can see that Barrow's choice of dactylic hexameter, a form associated not only with epic, but also with didactic, not to mention satire, a mode that is also distinctly operative, implicitly places the poem in this tradition. And in many ways, De Religione Turcica can be seen as a Lucretian assault on Islamic superstitio from the perspective of a 17th century Anglican scholar. Now, even the most cursory comparison of De Religione Turcica with Ufki's Epitome reveals extensive parallels, structural, thematic, and verbal even, which make Barrow's indebtedness to his Ottoman informant manifest. This can be seen first in the overall organization of De Religione Turcica. The poem is printed in the Opuscula, is not divided into sections of any kind, but it follows a clear structure that can be modeled as follows. First, the proem with the invocation of the muse, a bit on Muhammad and the birth of Muhammad as a personality and the birth of Islam, the origins of the Quran, the veneration of the Quran, the bulk of the poem being taken up with these 6 articles of faith, and then the 5 pillars in conversion crammed into a few lines at the very end of this. So compared with the scope of Ufki's treatise, there are nevertheless important differences. While roughly half of the Epitome is devoted to theological doctrine, almost the entirety of Barrow's is, with the 5 pillars as such relegated to less than 100 lines at the end, where the poem ends abruptly with the words caetera desiderantur, the rest is missing. The focus on belief is hardly surprising. The later parts of Ufki's Epitome elaborate on such phenomena as the precise and repetitive descriptions of prayer cycles or the exact calculations of charitable obligations, which, though full of remarkable detail, otherwise unknown to Christian Europe, make for rather uninspiring reading. Now, even granting the logic of Barrow's preoccupation with doctrine, however, personal emphases are apparent. Notably, the Islamic version of the Final Judgment seems to have greatly exercised Barrow's poetic imagination, for his treatment of this subject alone stretches to nearly 400 lines, or over a third of the length of the whole work. If Ufki's epitome, and I've left off the Latin here just for reasons of space, but if Ufki's epitome provides a largely disinterested view of its subject, Barrow's poem is from the start polemical and satirical, as is apparent from the opening lines. Who would think that fear of and zeal for the gods resides in these minds, or that divine worship touches souls devoid of humanity? As if his attitude were not clear enough, a scatological invocation of the muse at the end of the proem compares his inquiry into the nature of Islam to searching through feces. While De Religione Turcica depends on the epitome for most of its material, Barrow's perspective is obviously distinctly hostile in comparison with Ufki's. And a few examples here shall suffice to give some sense of the various ways in which Barrow appropriated Ufki's epitome to his own ends. We can begin, for instance, with the idea of rhetorical amplificatio, that Barrow in some places is simply trying to create an abundant, copious style of the sort extolled by Erasmus, and developing his source in this way. So, for instance, there's a moment where Ufki in the epitome stresses that in Islam, God is considered perfect and self-sufficient, lacking nothing. And Barrow then takes these straightforward statements and develops them into an apocalyptic vision of the collapse of religion and the destruction of the world. He experiences, that is God, no rewards, passions, cares. Imagine that the universe degenerates, that faith ceases, the worship of all divinity becomes banished, an oblivion of the sacred overwhelms the world, that deserted altars no longer smoke with their flames, that the heavenly machinery passes into ashes, the earth returns to primal chaos, everything is driven back into the bowels of nothingness, and the devoured ruins descend into calamity. He will not be less rich or happy. By no means will concern press upon him or pain afflict him. So such rhetorical elaborations and dilations add little in the way of animus to Barrow's source and should be understood as purely literary embellishments. But that is not the case for many other passages in the poem. And this is nowhere more manifest than in Barrow's treatment of the Islamic vision of paradise. So early modern Europeans habitually portrayed the Islamic conception of heaven as a sensual garden of earthly delights, which testified to the ultimately worldly nature of the religion. Ufki himself was quite graphic about the sexual dimension of the Islamic paradise, not only noting the presence of the celestial virgins, which are called hur, or huris, but remarking, there will be sex with young girls and boys, poetus, cum virginculis et puerilis. There will be discharge of sperm, however long as it pleases. Barrow seized on the opportunity to depict Islam as a religion of carnal indulgence, and what is worse, sodomy in early modern terms, and pedophilia. He writes, hur is the short name for the virgins, but long intercourse's pleasures shall stand out. It shall be permitted to copulate however long as it pleases. Sperm shall flow in a perpetual stream. Nor, for whom nature does not rebel in disgust, is it enough to have introduced that sex into heaven. Catamites, oh shame, have ascended the celestial vault, and a perverse lust for boys, esteemed for a handsome face, rages. So contemporary observers, both Christian and Muslim, commented widely on the prevalence of male-male sexual relations, or sodomy in early modern terms, throughout the Mediterranean and Ottoman world. And of course, Noel Malcolm has a new book about this. But the Quran mentions that the blessed in heaven, the Quran itself mentions that the blessed in heaven will be provided with beautiful cupbearers or serving boys, which could be the immediate source of Ufki's information. Regardless, Ufki has taken the graphic, if rather sober account of celestial sex that he found in Ufki's epitome, and he has transformed it into a clear tirade against Islamic depravity. So recent scholarship on the history of Orientalism has, among other things, increasingly called attention to the role that local informants and intermediaries, like the Ottomans of the Ottoman, like the Dragomans of the Ottoman capital, played in communicating knowledge of the Islamic world to Western scholars. Ufki's career provides a vivid example of such cultural mediation, as his writings, including the Epitome, were read, translated, and adapted by various European visitors to Istanbul. In his travel diary, the Swedish envoy Claes Rolam, for instance, was sent to the Sublime Porte by Karl X Gustav in 1657 to 58 to persuade the Ottomans to ally with Sweden in its war against Russia, credited his intelligence regarding Topkapi Palace to a renegado Albertus Babovius, a man of learning, well versed in the French, Italian, German, Latin, Greek, Turkish, and Arabian tongues. And Roland provided a Swedish paraphrase of Ufki's Epitome as the sum of the belief and doctrine of the Turks. Johann Ulrich von Waller, a member of the same diplomatic mission, subsequently published a miscellaneous German treatise on Islam dedicated to Carl Gustav that was partially based on the Epitome, which was provided to him, he said, by a Polish renegade in the Latin language during my time in Constantinople. Barrow's De Religione Turcica can be compared to these documents as yet another adaptation of Ufki's tract on Islam for a European audience, while at the same time, of course, differing greatly in the fact that the author sought to use his talents at Neo-Latin versification to give poetic expression to his understanding of the religion. Barrow's De Religione Turcica therefore represents a singular early modern literary engagement with Islam, as well as a revealing document in the history of Orientalism. Finally, unrelated, but this is my book that came out last year, Milton, Longinus, and the Sublime in the 17th Century. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to give this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. This was a very rich canvas which touched upon the English community, business community in the Levant, Neo-Latin didactic poetry, the circulation of this knowledge through intermediaries and dragomans. I think there will be a lot of questions, and I'll do my best to identify the speakers in their order. I saw Vladimír briefly and then Johanna, is that right?
No, I was only applauding. I have to think about my question. So Joanna goes first.
Okay.
I was actually also just applauding, but thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
Any question?
Stefano, if I may.
Yes.
Hello, Thomas. Thank you very much for an interesting talk. I don't have probably a good question, but I have a comment, if I may, regarding Polish work on Bobowski that was published actually last year. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It's Agata Pawlina's book on his life between. That's the subtitled Fact and Legend. I'm going to put a link to that in the chat.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name. Did you say Agata Pawlina?
Pawlina.
Pawlina, yeah, excuse me. I didn't get the pronunciation right.
I'm going to put it in the chat, for you or for anyone interested in the Polish contribution that was actually published last year on his autobiographical account among the poems that are also in Harley's manuscript at the British Library. And also the interpretations from the Polish and Ukrainian sources that she examined, and also the linguistic input, maybe something that you will find that might be interesting and pertinent to your research. And maybe if I just can ask a more general question on your very rich talk about this roots of Orientalism to Europe, especially to England, but also to other parts. How do you think it actually coexisted with all the political tensions, especially, among the anti-Islamic, let's say, wars that happened at that time in the 17th century? Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, it's only quite recently that my attention has been drawn, to Agata Pawlina's work on this area, though I know there's a lot of good Polish research being done in particular. For your question, do you mean the politics of the English civil wars in this context, or
maybe rather continental Europe? But of course, this roots, well, to England also in a way went from time to time also for continental Europe and Central Europe as well, you know, with lots of influences. So how does Orientalism really could happen with a lot of political and anti-Islamic tensions of the time in 17th century, in your opinion?
I'm not certain how to approach your question, which is a big question and an important one. Maybe I could take one angle, which would be confessional politics, because that's something that we can see in a lot of this. I mean, one thing that's very common, going back to Melanchthon, of course, is to kind of use Islam as a cudgel against Catholicism, something that Protestants would do. You see that in the 17th century with Hottinger, and Jan Loop has done work on him, for instance. And you see it in Barrow's poem too, De Religione Turcica, where I can't remember exactly how it's phrased, but he has said when he's treating the life of Muhammad, he refers to him as an angelicus doctor, or something like that, and it's in the context of his supposed kind of fabrications of the Quran and making it up from scraps of history that he didn't understand or something like that. So there's a sense of kind of doctoring the historical record, but of course there's a kind of jab there at Thomas Aquinas, I think, as well. So there are these moments of kind of where Barrow does these slight jabs at Catholics. I'm also curious about, so one thing I didn't get into is the way that these categories are kind of translated. So in the word lists, for instance, Sufi is translated as a Puritan in the English translation, right? Which is quite a loaded way of translating that. And Mufti is translated as something like, a bishop or something like this, right? Which in the, after the abolition of episcopacy in the 1640s, these are quite charged ways of translating things, but you can kind of see how Barrow's mind might have been working if Barrow is the one who's coming up with those bits in English. So I think about it in terms of confessional politics a lot, in terms of the broader kind of context. Of course, all of this is exploited for martial ends, to kind of raise sentiment against the Ottomans. But that's a bigger topic than I could perhaps get into here. But I think it certainly can be understood in that context. Yeah. But thank you for your comment and your question.
Thank you very much.
I'm trying to see everyone if there's a raised hand because I see the little screens on the top of the last slide. But as we are waiting, I may as well ask you a couple of very quick things. One is that I was struck by the fact that, it's about infrastructure. So the fact that Barrow did not pursue Arabic studies back in England with Wheelock, and then he did so after Livorno, after Ottoman court, does that suggest that in fact it was just a scarcity of means rather than an ideological orientation? Because many people have written in terms of like he did not want to do it at all for ideological reason. And the second question is a literary one. You suggested a neo-Lucretian critique of Religio. But on the other hand, thank you, because I see more faces. On the other hand, you mentioned also scatology and heroic comic imagery. So I wonder, is it really a neo-Lucretian gesture, or is it something that can be also brought together with things like Folengo? I don't know, like that kind of macaronic, mock epic poetry, which may have been a model. Of course, it's difficult to judge without the original Latin, but it's just a quick question.
Yeah, absolutely. So to the first question, yeah, it partly is a scarcity of resources, and I think it's Barrow's early interest in Arabic at Cambridge has been understated a little bit. So we have a couple of accounts at this point. One of them is calumny, which is coming sometime after, and says that I can't remember the wording, but it gives the impression that he kind of asked about the lessons and then was dissuaded and did absolutely nothing. But Abraham Hill's account, which is, he's someone, this London merchant and, person with various interests, but who's Barrow's biographer and knew him quite well, says that he tried it for a time, but then kind of couldn't persevere in it or attain anything. And I do think he spent a little more time on it than has been believed. And one of the reasons is because his library list includes a copy of Thomas Urpenius's Arabic grammar. So that suggests he at least went out and bought a book and spent a little time on it. But yeah, of course, at this time, the kind of infrastructure and means of learning Arabic at Cambridge is extremely limited, and especially when scholars, you're dependent on manuscripts primarily. There really aren't that many printed texts, and so I think that could dissuade a lot of scholars, even if they might otherwise be interested. So I could certainly see Barrow, if he had more resources, going into that. Not that he ever fancied himself as being an Arabist or an Orientalist, but this is part of his understanding that one must be a general scholar who pursues all of the disciplines. And so I think that's where his interest comes from. And I think similarly, I don't know how far he got in Turkish. He seems to have had some interest in it, as I think these word lists suggest. Again, it's maybe a lack of resources that, after he comes back to Cambridge in 1659, he doesn't have Ufki there tutoring him, so he probably, falls off in terms of the language. And he doesn't have Ufki as a resource for kind of telling him more about Ottoman culture that would allow him to maybe pursue and develop this, very ambitious idea of a poem of thousands of lines. So I think lack of resources is a cause of both of those things. And as for the question of whether it's really about being a kind of neo-Lucretian attack on Islamic superstitio versus being, satirical and mock epic in its modes, I think they're both at play here. Absolutely, yeah. That's why I just gestured to satire a little bit, but I think both of those modes are operative here. Certainly, yeah. Yeah, thank you for those questions.
No, thanks to you. We look forward to your edition. Yeah, it's nice that it's coming up.
It's due in December, so I'm finishing it now. So hopefully, about a year from now, I'll cross my.
So every December you have a book coming up, basically.
Well, we'll see. Not this December. Yeah.
We have time for more questions, taking advantage of Thomas' presence, his generosity, very, very rich. As you said, it's a sandwich between book projects. Yes, please go ahead, Lenka. I saw.
Well, if I can, I'm interested in the institution of Dragoman in general. In Czech literature, we have some mentions, especially from the 19th century, that implies that often Jews as used as dragomans. Is it common or it's something special for Czech literature?
Well, I should say I'm not an expert in dragomans, but I do know that as such, this is something I've come into more from the English side. But I do know I have encountered, for instance, when I was looking into this, I mentioned Spencer Breton, who is the consul in Izmir. He mentions in his will 3 dragomans who I suspect, based on their names, are Greek and Armenian. I'm not sure. I don't think there were any Jewish dragomans mentioned in this particular document. But I mean, as I understand it, this is a role that appealed to a lot of non-Ottoman Muslims, and especially if we think about these areas, as I mentioned, Pera has a couple of synagogues in addition to all of these churches and so forth. So I would imagine that that's not limited to the Czech sources or something like that. But I couldn't. I'm not the person, I should say, to speak definitively on that, as I'm not a historian of the Dragomans as such. I just know from what I've read or can remember now. But thank you for the question.
I thank for the answer. And may I once more question? Was it an institution, or each interpret could be called dragoman in this period?
There were, and again, I speak not as so much as an expert on the Dragomans, but and from my understanding, I mean, there are institutions, but there are also kind of individual operators. I think like the Venetians have a kind of a setup where they're training Dragomans. But I don't think, for instance, that the English at this point had something quite like that. So they're just kind of hiring individual contractors, if you will, or something like that. So that's how kind of Ali Ufki comes into their employ. But take what I say about Dragomans with something of a grain of salt, please.
Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Well, it is true that the Dragomans in the English console house seems to be structured later, no, like at the turn of the century, really, with Thomas Smith and other such figures. A question that a historian might want to ask you is how much of what you talk to us is local and how much is distributed? And is so in a sense of a production of knowledge, you mentioned Simon Mills and his work on that. So the problem is really, are we dealing with something that how do we conceptualize the relationship between local and the global in terms of this diffusion? You mentioned the miscellaneous character of your sources, that there's been a very like almost encyclopedic sense of putting together fragments as if in a encyclopedia. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, and the question of local too is complicated because I can think of Ali Ufki as a local Ottoman informant, but of course he's not from Istanbul. He's from Lviv. So I mean, we deal with a lot of complicated identities here. And Barrow, I think, if you see from the fragmentary nature of this, I mean, he's not a Pocock or even a Selden or something like this. He's trying to piece these fragments together, working from the perspective of a general scholar who thinks that this might be of something of interest, something of use to his Cambridge colleagues, and maybe beyond that. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to speak grandly on these larger dynamics, I suppose, but I think I think we can see, especially that Ufki has this wider influence. That's I mean, many others have written on Ufki, but I think we're only really starting to get a sense of just how deeply an individual actor like Ufki could kind of penetrate all of these networks throughout Europe, in Sweden, Germany, England, and beyond, Italy, through all of these different writings and so forth. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's certainly something to think about.
Absolutely. Well, we still have a few minutes if you like. There are a number of other things. There's the mention of the Janua by Comenius, which might interest some of you, I know, Vlad.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Thomas, for your paper. And I, of course, am interested in the reference to Janua Lingvarium you mentioned. If indeed there were translation of Janua into the Turkish, I would like to know more if there was if you came across any more reference to the Turkish or to the Ottoman interest in Christian textbooks in general. If I'm interested if this was in fact just exception, if there were such a translation, if it was an exception, or if there is any broader interest in textbook production coming from Christian territories. I apologize for this question. It's completely out of my ignorance, but I'm just curious. Thank you.
No, it's a good question, and it's something. It's another topic that I can only speak to in a limited way. There has been some work on this. I think and if you ask me later, I can send this to you. I think in one or several of Hannah Neudecker's articles on Ufki, these are discussed more extensively. But my understanding is, I mean, this is something that's it's an issue of supply, that the Europeans want to supply the Turks with these sorts of translations, but I'm not sure just how much interest there is actually in the Ottoman Empire. So this is a project where, so I think for a lot of these kinds of translation projects, whether it's of excuse me, Comenius's Janua or the Bible or something like this, the idea is part of this larger kind of international, ambitious, often Protestant reform project that we can proselytize, we can convert, we can, create this this new world, if only we can get all of these works translated and start to form minds. But again, it's a matter of people like Levinus Warner and others who are pushing for these translations to be made. I don't know how much interest there actually was on the side. If someone's done if some Ottomanists have done some archival research on this, I haven't heard about it. I'd love to hear about it, but I don't know of any actual kind of demand side interest in these. They seem to be just pushed by Europeans, as I understand it.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. That was my feeling actually as well, that the motivation on the side of Europeans is quite understandable, but whether there was any demand or interest on the Ottoman side, that's the question. Okay. Right. Thank you.
Very well. Well, perhaps we have reached the natural end of this hour together. I don't know if there's any other quick comment or question free to do. Otherwise, my task is to then sort of set up the next talk, which will happen a week from now. Oh, Steve, sorry, I see you now. Please go ahead.
Oh yes, this is a short one. I think I'm just interested to know. Isaac Barrow was obviously very interested in mathematics. He produced, I'm not exactly sure when, but an edition of Euclid's Elements and his own lectures in geometry. Is there any evidence in the word list, perhaps, or in the poetry of exchanges in Constantinople regarding mathematics or astronomy, that sort of thing?
It's a great question. The short answer is no, there's absolutely nothing in the way of that. There are moments in the poem where he kind of gestures to natural philosophical interests. That's it. And there's nothing in the word list or anything like that that suggests this. I do think it's worth saying, though, that it's absolutely true that especially his early interest in Arabic is partly motivated by getting to those mathematical sources. Later, he's working on I think he's reading Borelli's translation and other. So he's very interested, and there's clear evidence in Arabic as a medium for lost translations of mathematicians and that sort of thing. So that's clearly a motivating factor for him. But in terms of his actual visit to the Ottoman Empire, there's nothing of that sort.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to mention that in the 1660s, there is a Medicean project of translating the conics of Apollonius And in fact, if there's any trace of mathematical learning, it would be connected to that, because it's kind of it's a rival project. So the Florentines are trying to do one edition, and then Golius in the Netherlands is trying to do another, and they mostly compete for sources that are located in the Vatican Library and so on. And it's exactly the same period of well, John Finch, who also travels to the Ottoman Empire and so on. And so it seems to be that there is this kind of Orientalist well, mathematical quest, if you will, in the structures of scientific structures of the Medici regime that could be echoed. Certainly was. I mean, Barrow must have been responsive. In fact, Moti Feingold wrote extensively about the fact that Isaac Barrow may have been an originator of the Accademia del Cimento. And I must say, many Italian scholars do not buy this argument. But nevertheless, you know, there is the question that in his travels to Italy, to Florence and Livorno, he spurred a kind of new experimental, well, academy of sorts in the period.
Certainly, yeah. And needless to say, Feingold is the person Moti Feingold is the person to go to for all things Isaac Barrow, among many other topics. Yeah, and just to add to that, yeah. So it's actually the case that you know, we have some of Barrow's comments on the translation that he read of the conics of those Arabic books, where he kind of he's kind of suspicious of the translation, not that he actually understands the Arabic, but based on his understanding of the extant Greek books. And then later on, actually, there was an attempt by in this 1660s and 1670s. There was an attempt by, at the University of Oxford to produce a complete text of Apollonius, which would have included Barrow's Latin version of the Greek books, together with a translation from the Arabic manuscript, actually. So that just goes to show that, yeah, Barrow is plugged into what's going on in Italian mathematics, and Barrow has this real fascination with Arabic as a conduit of mathematical knowledge. So that's clearly a motivating factor, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting, yeah.
That's fantastic. Yeah, very much. Well, it's nice to close on this note, really, of academic cooperation and sort of the phantom of Apollonius, just how to reconstruct it and so on. We thank you so much, Thomas. This was very, very learned, very engaging, and congratulations on the previous book on Longinus, Milton, and then the new one for the a new Christmas gift. Now, next week on the same Monday, same hour, we will host the series from Prague, and we have our own Eva, our own Polish Dragoman, who is in attendance now, and she will offer a paper on desiderata, or experimental wish list, as a case study to discuss the role of cooperation and protocols for academic cooperation. So you'll see the title, the link stays the same, so it won't change from week to week. And I hope to see you all and many more. So have a wonderful start of the week wherever you are.